Please stand with me for a reading of the Word. Our scripture this morning is going to be 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 16. Honor widows who are widows indeed, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in petitions and prayers night and day. But she who lives in self-indulgence is dead even while she lives. And command these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in affliction, if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get remarried, thus incurring condemnation, because they have set aside their previous pledge. And at the same time, they also learn to be idle and go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no opportunity for reviling. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing woman has widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. You may be seated. This week's message is titled Care of Widows. Last week our mention was one of correcting the saints, and we visited how to correct an older man, a younger man, an older woman, and a younger woman. I also made mention that the whole chapter fed off of the initial statement in verse 1 of do not sharply rebuke, and that the rest of the verses were a play off of that statement, do not sharply rebuke, but instead do blank. And this week we'll be carrying on with that same specific category. Don't rebuke widows, but in order give them instruction in this case, and also biblical correction in the right places. But this is general instruction and correction for all of us in regards to widows. But let me plainly say that the care of widows in the church is a very vital issue, and one sadly that has either been abused in overcare or abused by neglect. Now God designed men to be responsible for the protection and provision of the whole world, but initially their families first. And therefore, the other side of this coin is that women are to be the recipients then of that provision and protection. God tells us in Scripture that women are the weaker vessel, and men then by contrast are the stronger vessel, her protector. He is to cast a wide umbrella, and she's to be cared for under that umbrella of that protection, provision, authority, and direction. So that is the biblical nature of and roles of men and women. When you come into widows, then they are women without a husband, women who have lost their husband, and therefore their means of support, provision, and protection, and very special concern to God, who created these natures and roles. And so God takes great interest in protecting the woman that can essentially not protect herself. And so the second group of people who come into this unusual protective care of God would be orphans. In Psalm 68, God says, a father of the fatherless. And so if you are one of these particular groups, please hear me. God is specifically concerned to protect those who have lost their protection, their preservation, and their provision. Now, I mentioned the fact that God has set up both roles and natures of men and women individually, but it's important to mention the following of God's intended roles and natures by both provides blessing to both the individual themselves and the families, and that creates then the ideal of the way the Creator has made us. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. This is not an unattainable ideal. This is the attainable ideal that is to be pursued in spite of any situation or circumstance. Now, because of the nature of sin and death, this isn't always an easy path. In fact, this path is usually not followed perfectly, even though we are to do so. So as we continue this message, if you're thinking to yourself, I was never taught that, or I was never treated like that, or I've made a mess of things in my own life. First off, repent of sin you have, and then start making corrective actions and seek wise counsel to help you in that. And for the sins committed against you, whether it was a sin of your parents, the sin of a spouse, or anyone else for that matter, forgive them or be in preparing to forgive them, to be ready to forgive them. And then in its same breath, also start making corrective movements in that to alleviate the sin in those positions. Now, we need to spend a little bit more time in God's design and role for women. And let me say this very, very clearly. It has been said in error, and again, it has been said in error. A woman's place is in the home, which is not biblical at all. The Bible teaches that a woman's priority is to be the home, not her place, but her priority. And there are several ways this can be done rightly. But however, there are way more ways that this can be done in error. A woman's priority in the home is different than the husband's priority in the home. She is the one responsible for the management of that home, both by her nature and her role. And her orientation, her focus, and her direction, therefore, should be her home. We need to take a look at Proverbs 31. Please turn with me to Proverbs 31. We'll be looking at Proverbs woman. So often, sadly, and most people, they breeze through this orientation of a woman, and it's this idea of a woman who's barefoot and pregnant. She's 19 kids and counting, Martha Stewart, this unattainable ideal, and women have been beaten down terribly by this. But what it truly is it's a timeless set of principles, and not as much on the practical application. However, there is practical application there. And so it's more of the principle that we want to gain from this. And so when you look at this whole section of the Proverbs 31 woman, starting in verse 10, let me say this woman is the chief operations officer, the COO of a multi-diversified business. She is second in command only to the CEO. The COO is responsible for the day-to-day operations of a business and the property as a whole. The divisions of the company she is responsible for and in charge of start with her chief responsibility, her chief priority is as wife and mother. We see this in verses 10 through 12 and 15. Verse 15, and she rises while it is still night and gives food to her household and a portion to her young women. This whole series of the Proverbs 31 woman starts with this principle. The priority for a woman is to be a wife and mother. And is supported then by the trust of her husband as you move through these verses. And ladies, men do not trust those that they don't respect, and they do not love those they don't respect and trust. And so her priority is where she places all of her value. And then these verses move into extensions of that priority. And this is where she adds additional value and worth, not only to herself, but also to the family as a whole. And so in verse 13, we see she is a purchasing manager. She searches for the wool and flax. Verse 13, wool was used for making clothing in the winter. Flax was used for making clothing in the summer. But if you don't buy a low price and then being able to turn a profit at that point is very, very difficult. So she is a very savvy purchasing manager to purchase things at the right cost in the right place. And so the second, if you don't buy quality product, then no one will want your product. And we see in verses 21 through 22, her quality of linen is extremely high. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She makes coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Verse 14, we now move into another responsibility as an import trade manager. She is like merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. Verse 14. I actually found several commentaries that got this all wrong. They were pointing that this verse is specifically talking that she walks long distances to get food. There could be that, but that's really all wrong. Merchant ships, what they do is they take a high commodity item over a great distance to trade for another high commodity item of higher value. And so in this case, she's trading high value linen for high value food. And in a time of famine, food was one of the utmost commodities. And so in her case, through her skills, she can make a higher value linen at a better profit than she can growing her own food. And so just to note, growing her own food would actually keep her at home for more hours of the day if she spent her time doing that. But in her case, in her skill set, it's better to turn the profit with clothing and then be able to purchase food, or through trade in this particular case. And so this isn't the practical application of she's only allowed to be a farmer or a clothing maker. That principle is totally wrong. The principle of this verse here is that making a profit, she is to make a profit with the skills, talents that she possesses, as well as the opportunities before her. And so those are going to be different for every woman. So then we go into verse 16, where she diversifies her own business and becomes a real estate mogul. And let me say that again. Verse 16, she is a real estate mogul. She makes plans for a field and buys it. And then she turns that the fruit of her hands and plants a vineyard. This is a huge deal. This is so often overlooked. She purchases a piece of property, and more than likely with the earnings from the sales that she had gotten from her linens, from the clothing she manufactured in verses 19 and 22. And then she takes that property and turns it into something more profitable. So not only does the property itself increase in value, but now the yield from that property improves from, instead of being a field, to now being a vineyard, where you can have wine production and increase your overall yield. This is no joke. This is not a couch potato sitting at home. Making a move like this requires intelligence, planning, a great deal of business sense, and hard work to be pulled off. And this too is not another practical application for careers that women are allowed to have. This principle is of women investing and then turning a profit from the investment. So she first invested in her specific skills and talents for making clothing. Now she is taking the profit from that and investing in a different occupation and investment to bring a second income to her own. And so she now has two occupations on top of her priority as a wife and mother. Verse 19, we see the origins of essentially where all this started, as a textile production manager. Verse 19, she stretches out her hands to the distaff. Her hands hold fast to the spindle. She makes linen garments and sells them, gives the belts to the tradesmen. That too is not a single application of women that are allowed to make money only from making clothing. This is the principle of investing in a skill that she has and turning that skill into a profit. And then in verse 20, we come to her as a philanthropist. She extends her hand to the poor, and she stretches out her hands to the needy. And what is the biblical principle of philanthropy? It is out of the excess that our giving is to occur. And the greater the excess, the greater that we are to give. But it's also the greater that we actually can give. And so she is able to become a philanthropist because of the excess she created, not what her husband created, what she created. That is the Proverbs 31 woman. Vocationally, this woman is not locked up in the house with a false ideology of a woman's place is only at home. That's the place she operates out of. The priority is her home. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and bless her. As for her husband, he praises her, saying, many daughters have done excellently, but you have gone above them all. Verses 27 through 29. A woman's priority should be her husband and her children. But a competent, highly intelligent, educated woman can do all kinds of things from both home and away from home. So the one rule of thumb when it comes to work, career, or business for women, and it should be this: is this an obvious part of my priority? Meaning, do your husband and children benefit from this type of specific work that you're pursuing? Or is this an extension of my priority that provides benefit without providing conflict to my priority? Or lastly, can this be negative effect on my priority? So you can't just make a cookie cutter rule and say women can't work for more than half a mile radius from their house. It has to have those three components that are addressed. Now, let me say this: a woman staying home 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, can be completely worthless. We see this all the time. Minivan moms running their kids from one activity to the next without actually being moms. They have coaches, teachers, tutors, and all the other activities to actually raise their children. And so the key to the whole thing is, what is your priority? What do you spend your time with? And for the women, their priority is to be their husband and their children. But in order to do that, you have to have a willing and able person to manage and wear many different hats. And all of those will vary depending on the woman herself, her gifting, and her circumstances. And so this can be a razor thin line or a blatant, obvious line depending on the situation. But the Proverbs 31 woman is actually a dual income home. But there's a difference to a woman whose priority is in her home and that her financial earning is an extension of that. Many times dual income in these homes is honestly the savings she provides by there not having to be childcare. But this can be done in error too, because if you're allowing TV or tablets to raise your children in a home, you're not doing them any good there either. So the staying home is not the design. It's only a possible component. There's also the twin careers paradigm, where both the husband and wife are climbing the corporate ladder and the kids ultimately are just in their way. So you subcontract out their raising and rearing to someone else, because in the business model, the priority is money and status, not the growth and character of your family and your children. And then the last option, which is the most grotesque, is the wife being the complete earner and the husband being a stay-at-home dad. And this is a complete perversion and distortion of the natures and roles established by God. And I'm not saying the dad can never be home. I had a father who was a firefighter. He worked 24 hours on, and was home for then 48 hours. We did everything together when he was home. But that's not the same thing as a husband and a wife switching roles. On the opposite side, there are those who then teach falsely that women should not even be educated or trained outside of anything except reading recipes or cleaning the house, which is ridiculous. It's not even Christian, and it's radically unbiblical. I love Doug Wilson said that the level of education that your daughters receive will be the level of education of your grandsons. Let me say that again. The level of education that your daughters receive will be the level of education of your grandsons. So when your daughters receive a certain level of education, they're going to marry a certain strata of man. And that's going to be a sort of an upper limit for where your grandsons can get to. So train the women, train the young women. And it's not possible, honestly, to have education, learning, expertise, and competence be bestowed only to men and then ignore the women. You can't do it, and biblical Christians wouldn't even think about doing it. But the principle generally is the man is to go outside the home, provide and protect. The woman is to be oriented to the home as her priority. But the Bible then allows for all kinds of flexibility within the realm of home and orientation of how that's to be done. Now, further, when it comes to God's design, producing from there, girls are to start out under the protection and provision of their fathers. And then girls under their fathers are to grow into women and move from their father to being under protection and provision of their husbands. But when they lose those opportunities and those privileges in that area of protection, then God takes up their case. And this is where we start in verse 3. And we went through all of that to verse 3, honor widows. And the principle number one in this text is the obligation of the church to support the widows. But notice at the end of verse 3, who are widows indeed, meaning honor widows that are real widows. Widows to us means a woman whose husband is dead. But the Greek is not limited to just that. It has far more explanation. So the word widow is kera, which means robbed. Somebody took something from you, meaning suffered a loss. It carries the idea of being completely alone. And so the word in Greek doesn't just speak only of death. It is the loss of her husband. And so this in this day and age could entail death, divorce, desertion, anything that removes him. And so you could also essentially have, like I said, divorce or just someone leaving her altogether. And so all of that can be summed up into the widow word biblically. And so it's just a person who has lost their husband, however that occurred. So then who is Paul talking about? Well, we get more insight from the word honor. And we're talking about the same kind of honor from the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and your mother, and in the days you may prolong the land which Yahweh your God gives you. Exodus 20:12. And so this isn't just about respect and what you're giving them. It's about financial support. You need to support these women. They cared for you when you were young. You care for them when the need arises in their old age. And so now, what widows are to be supported? So it says, honor widows that are real widows or genuine widows, the truly alone, the truly without resources. Not every woman is in that situation, however. Not every woman is truly doomed. It is the responsibility of the husband, and many husbands have done very, very well with the resources, and they've left their widowed wives with a home, with a bank account, with insurance policies, whatever it may be, so that they have everything that they need for their continued care while that husband is gone. But the point is financial support, and the widows that are real widows are the ones that are needing that kind of support. And those that have no source of income, they've lost their husbands, they're desolate, they're totally alone, they have no help. And we then have the responsibility in that case to take her case up, essentially. So the church has an obligation then to support widows. Verse 4 introduces the process for the church to evaluate those widows needing support. Let me just say right off, no church has unlimited funds and cannot indiscriminately take on everyone who applies for help. There has to be some kind of criteria, and that comes from verses 4 through 8. So verse 4, if any woman who cannot care for herself, first start with her children and her grandchildren. That is where this is to start. That is who bears the responsibility at first. And this goes back to the Proverbs 31 woman. The first priority of the Proverbs 31 woman is her husband and her children. Then her extension in caring for them creates an abundance. And that same abundance is now transferred to her descendants and repays back on both accounts, care for care and financial for financial. And the mother, failing to be a mother, doesn't remove the responsibility from her descendants, but that will increase the overall difficulty of what they will be able to assist with. And so this we can't really avoid not talking about our own current welfare system that our government has created, and it has systematically shattered the American family so that children grow up dependent on the state and then repeat that cycle over and over and over again. So we've had feminism attacking women to draw them away from their first priority and go into the work field, and welfare attacks women from the opposite side and conditions them to never produce anything themselves or earn any kind of income so that they're completely dependent on the state. And hear me, when you get biblical exegesis wrong, so many things can go wrong. And in here, particularly, the widows are going to be directly affected by that, either by destroying the family on the front end or destroying the family on the back end, either way, or both, which would be worse. So verse 4, the care of widows is to start from her own family. And Jesus showed us this exact care he had for his mother while he was hanging on the cross, his responsibility as her eldest son, as she is a widow. And he assigned her care to John. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then pointing to John, and he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that hour, the disciple took her into his home. John 19:26 through 27. Now, notice as we move into verse 5, he digs a little more deeply into some of the criteria for supporting widows. So when you come across a widow who truly is a widow, totally left without resources, we have a responsibility to her. And so in verse 5, here's the criteria. She trusts in God. She has her fixed hope is a better way the Greek has it, her fixed hope on God. she is not only in a continual condition of being without a means, but she's also in a continual condition, of presenting God as her only hope, meaning she's a Christian. And that's the kind of widows the church is responsible to support. Number one, those who have no children or grandchildren who are supporting them. Number two, a widow who is a believer, a single woman having lost her husband who is a true believer. And she, if she's never had a husband and is single, then she's still in the care of her father. And so this reminds me of a great story in Acts 9. You turn with me to Acts 9, verses 36 and following. So as we start in verse 36, so in Joppa, there was a believer named Tabitha. Some versions may have Dorcas. Here is a Christian lady, a disciple, full of good works, alms deeds, charity, giving to people who were in need. And it came to pass in those days, she became sick and she died. And when she died, they washed her body and they laid it in the upper chamber, and there would be viewing and mourning at this time. The disciples heard that Peter was close by there and sent him 2 men desiring to bring him to them so that he would not delay. Peter at this point had already demonstrated the obvious power of God. He had healed a man with John at the gate, and most likely they had felt that in this sense that Peter could do something in regard to this lady. So as soon as they got to Peter, Peter arose and went with them. Peter was brought to the upper chamber. And what do we find in the upper chamber? All the widows that were standing by, weeping and showing the coats and garments which Tabitha, who had died, had made. And so Tabitha was the caretaker of the widows. And we don't have any idea how many were there, but we do know that it was a significant amount. And so here's a dear lady who used her resources to make clothing for the widows. Does that sound anything like the Proverbs 31 woman, giving her hand to the poor, taking care of the church's widows? But the picture here is just this absolute destitution of widows, the complete lack of resources and dependency on somebody else. So Peter puts the widows out of the room, most likely because of how much they were crying and how sad they were, and it would just be easier to remove them. So he put them out, and he kneeled down, and he prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up, gave him her hand, and lifted her up. And then Peter called the saints and the widows, and presented her alive. This is the second resurrection that occurs in the New Testament, completely to the benefit of widows. We first saw in Luke's gospel the first reference when the son of the widow Nan was raised from the dead. And here you see the compassion of God towards the widow. And here it's amazing. These broken-hearted widows are comforted by this woman, and then she dies. And so their brokenheartedness returns. And so predominantly on their behalf, Tabitha was for them. And it's so interesting that how God cares for widows. He cares through the church family. And in this instance, through Tabitha. And so although the miracle of Peter rising Tabitha from the dead, don't miss the fact, is doing the returning of the caretaker to the widows. That is why she was raised from the dead. The text here is very clear. We are not responsible to support all widows, but we are responsible to protect the widows who are widows indeed and the ones that are believers. That is who we are to be in communion with. That is our responsibility. Now, we can choose to help others out of our abundance, but we are mandated to take care of the ones with us. So this is why when we come to verse 6, it starts with the but. That single woman who has lost her husband, who lives in pleasure and self-indulgence, is dead where she lives. In other words, the one who goes out and lives for her own ease, and all she wants is her own satisfaction, her own indulgence. She may be living physically, but she is dead. She is spiritually dead. And this is why we started in Proverbs 31, and now we can very well compare, was she like the Proverbs 31 woman who then lost her husband, or was she like the harlot who then lost her husband? And so women who have completely lived for themselves and continue to do so, they have no family, they have to go out and support themselves. And let me say, there are many, many women who have come open handed to churches and used all the right grace language and God and Jesus and come open handed just to get money and care. And then they continue to make bad decision after bad decision, the whole time decreeing their undying love for the church and God. And they don't hope in God for their guidance. They don't depend on God. They have no heart for Him. They'd rather live in pleasure. They give life a pleasure only for themselves. They're buying cigarettes and booze instead of paying rent, and then cry for money when they get booted out. Or fail to show up to work on time, get fired, and then cry because they can't afford their own electricity. Those that create their own messes need to dig themselves out of those holes. Women like this are the same picture of the prodigal son. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey to a distant land where he squandered his estate living recklessly. Luke 15:13. So just like the prodigal son, let the prodigal daughters be driven back to Christ through pain and suffering. And this is why in verse 7, Paul says, command that they be blameless above reproach. This is an echo found in Titus. This testimony is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be found sound in the faith. Titus 1:13. This verse and verse 7 encompasses everything he said from verse 3 up until this point. You command these people, Timothy, that they may be found without blame. And this is why we started with Proverbs 31 woman, to get that part right in your churches first. Then hold the families to the requirements set in verse 4, and hold all the widows to the requirements set in verse 5. Everybody should be involved in keeping them above reproach. The church should be a model of virtue in that area, leaving no legitimate fault to be exploited by the critics. So here in verse 7, the reputation of the church is what is at stake. And if the church is to be blameless, you better be commanding them in these things at this time. Tell your people they are responsible for the caring of widows. But think of all the money. Just think of all the money that has been spent on extravagant church buildings, gymnasiums, family life centers, and the like. Millions upon millions of dollars to create a weekly theme park to make you feel better about yourself and going to church, instead of caring for widows and orphans. I actually read about a school the other day where one of the options in high school was, instead of going to gym class, you could actually go and mow the lawn and do handyman work for widows in their town. Wow. School is doing that. What an amazing idea to do for especially the high school children in that day, in that town. That is the example that we should be looking at. Now, verse 8 is a flip back to verse 4, and truly the Proverbs 31 woman. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Woo. That is literally throwing the gauntlet out. This is such a heavy statement. Paul is actually stating here a Christian can be worse than a non-Christian. The simple fact, you are worse than an unbeliever if you do not take care of your own. And in fact, it brings into question the very fact of, are you a believer at all if you fail to take care of your own? And the picture here is just like the church discipline from Matthew 18 from last week. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses even to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, Matthew 18:17. And this is not a break in the action at all. The term but keeps us flowing in this whole context. In verse 8, Paul is negatively stating what he positively stated in verse 4. And so verse 4 is kind of like, first of all, children, take care of your parents. It's kind of kind tone and expression. Verse 8, he says, if you don't, you are worse than an unbeliever. The tone changes to righteous anger. You are horrid. And so that's the positive to negative. And he goes beyond parents there. He gives us more criteria to evaluate our own responsibility to our own. And this is the tie back to Proverbs 31. The priority of a mother is to be her husband and her children. The priority of grown children is to be their parents and the rest of their own families. And so verse 9, we actually come to a break in the action in the conversation slightly. We're still talking about true widows, but Paul is changing his aim and his focus slightly. And truly, after going through this myself, this is probably my single favorite principle in the whole letter to Timothy. Verse 9 and 10 is pointing out that in local churches at this time, there was a group of widows who were given a semi-official or even an official status as servants of the church. The church had elders and deacons. We saw that back in chapter 3. And this verse points out to another sort of quasi-official group, and that was the older widows. The church had a group of older widows who was their responsibility was spiritual ministry to women. And they would be fulfilling the instructions of Titus, let the older women teach the younger women. They were a godly group of women who served the church in some official recognized way. The church actually identified them as such. So verse 9 and 10 give the qualifications. The qualifications actually sound a lot like elders and deacons. Verse 9, let not a widow be taken into the list under 60 years old. Again, she's older in age. Verse 10, having been a one-man woman, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed in every good work. This is a list of qualifications for older Christian women, if I've ever heard one. And it sounds like the qualifications, honestly, truly for an elder in chapter 3. And so I've had people ask me, should women hold the office of elder? And my answer is always with love, no, that is not for them. It's directed for men. But hear me, this is an official or unofficial, who cares, either way, office for older women. And the requirements in this list are no joke. In some ways, they're so much more difficult than the elders' requirements. And like the elders, whether you're called to be one or not, this should be every woman's aim. And to have worked diligently that if the need would arise, that you were needed, you could immediately fill this position. And these women would be out in the homes of other young Christian women, assisting them with divine instruction and practical application from home to home. And so these women they'd even move in with them and help them with the raising of their young children. They assisted with strangers and visitors and traveling preachers and pastors, whatever, providing a home for them. These women had a very important role in the ministry of the church. And how often I've sadly hear women who have young children would have loved to have had an older woman in their home helping them, just even giving them guidance. And to think of how many women in error have fallen for the feminist lie on the front end, and then failed to raise by failing to raise their own families. And then on the back end, they have another opportunity, and they could help someone young in their retirement. Instead, they'd rather sit and do nothing in Palm Springs or Florida, or travel the world, as they say, and see whatever people see traveling. What a legacy to leave. I worked my whole life, then I retired to see a bunch of worldly stuff, then I died. Wow, I wonder if anyone will mourn when you were gone. I think of countless stories that others have shared me, their grandmothers being there almost every single day, and the impact that those godly women left on their lives. And now 10, 20, 30 years after these women have passed and gone to live with the Lord, you still see the tears that come from the legacy that was left behind. So women, do not blow your first chance at being someone's hero by being their mother. And don't blow your second chance at being someone's hero by being their grandmother, either by blood or by the blood of Christ. And just imagine if the church today had such a group of women whose total life and preoccupation was to move around from home to home and help younger mothers with the process of raising children. And if those older women were godly and had raised godly children, and they had lodged strangers, and they washed the feet, and were always reported of good works, think of what a tremendous ministry and influence that church and that congregation would have wholly to the rest of the world. And this is the design for women. It starts with a Proverbs 31 woman. It ends with the woman described right here. And think of Tabitha. That was Tabitha. That's what she was doing. So in verse 9, one of the qualifications for them was being over the age of 60. But here is a change for the younger women. Verse 11, refuse to put them on the list. We're going to jump to verse 14 quickly. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no opportunity for reviling. Younger women who have lost their husbands are to remarry. That you cannot miss. I want. Bulamai, it's a very strong word. It's more of a commandment that the younger remarry. Verse 11 is one of those tricky verses if you read it out of context and don't continue into verse 14. And this similar caution is very similar to about the young believers becoming elders and not a new convert, so that he will not become conceited and fall into the condemnation of the devil. 1 Timothy 3:6. so that he will not a maybe, this is a definite. And so, in the same way, we don't want the younger women to fall. Not that they might fall, they will fall, so that he commands them to remarry in verse 14. And this is where the term widow ties into the other forms of being a widow. 1 Corinthians 7:15 says, if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. A believer is not in bondage. So once that unbeliever has said, I can't take this, I refuse to be married to a Christian, and they split, and a woman becomes a desolate woman, she has lost her husband, she is still young, she is still in a situation where biblically she is given the pledge and the right to remarry based on 1 Corinthians 7:15. There's also those young women whose husbands engage themselves in all kinds of sexual sin. We saw this in the Lord Jesus in Matthew 5 and also Matthew 19 says that anyone who divorces for the grounds other than sexual sin creates adultery. But the clear implication is where you have sexual sin and it's unrepented of and continuous, that is a grounds for the dissolution of marriage. In Romans 7, we obviously tells when a man dies, that should be obvious. The marriage union is broken, and therefore she is free to remarry at that point. So looking at it, you have the desertion of an unbeliever, you have the fornication of a partner, or from the standpoint of death, it's the obvious. Scripture allows remarriage of that woman. The innocent party in adultery, the believer left that unbeliever, they are free to marry. So when you come to verse 11, here's what would happen. One of these young women would lose their husband. Maybe he died, maybe he left, or maybe there was divorce because of adultery. And she was not to be sentenced in that ugly relationship for the rest of her days. But now she's single, and she's brokenhearted. She more than likely had it with men altogether because of this one man. And so she feels burned and hurt, and in her young years and emotional in that moment, and she may even be still in love with the man that left. She says, I'll never get into another relationship, and from here on, I'm going to devote my life to the Lord. So Paul, as an elder, who is also a wife's father to a daughter, says, I want the younger widows to get married. And this is a protection not only from the world itself, but from her own self. So verse 11 begins this desire to marry. And the failure to follow that desire will result in the disregard for Christ by the means of sexual desire, also in verse 11. And our text says sensual, but the word here is far more graphic and illicit, incurring condemnation due to that in verse 12. And because they have set aside their pledge, the pledge comes from 1 Corinthians 7:39 through 40. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that is good for them, that they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than burn with passion. 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9, excuse me. And that's what's going to happen, he said, is this, is in their pain, in their hurt, they're going to make a pledge to God, similar to how Paul did. And when the woman makes a pledge to God and is widowed, she has to keep that pledge. God puts a high premium on integrity of speech and didn't want people making covenants that they weren't intending to keep. And so here is this woman. She makes a rash pledge to God, having lost her husband. And after a little while, the grieving process is over. And then she can feel is the desire to be married again. And as she feels that desire to be married, without that marriage, the growth of sexual and perverted desires that ultimately lead to complete disregard for Christ in verse 11, and from the pledge she made in verse 12. And that's when we move into verse 13 with the increase of sin. And so you start making a foolish pledge in the heat of pain, sexual desires and temptation step in, the pledge for Christ becomes disregarded, and you go from house to house then sharing that sin like their first mother Eve. Saw what she wanted, desired it, took it, and then shared it. And so she's either sharing her sin with another person's husband, which is very common, or sharing that sin with other women by gossiping about it or talking about improper things in general. Verse 14, therefore get married and give the enemy no opportunity for reviling. Verse 15, even though some have already fallen in after their sexual desires and simply fallen in being a woman through idleness, gossiping, busybodies, reminds me of the warning from 1 John. And they went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they were of us, they would have remained with us. They went out, and so that they would not be manifested that they are not of us. 1 John 2:19. And here again is that direct link. This is absolutely a direct link to verse 27 of the Proverbs 31 woman. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat of the bread of idleness. And so at the very end of verse 16, Paul wraps this up, his argument, and bringing back full circle where he started. He says this: the church has an obligation to make sure capable women also support their widows, just like Tabitha does. That's verse 16. And so this is the path of responsibility. First, you start with the children and grandchildren. Secondly, a man that is connected to her to provide. And thirdly, a woman connected to her to provide. And so there were women in those days who had the resources, just as we do now. Some of them might have been widowed themselves, or have been married to an unbeliever who were then given the management of their own household because they're the believer and their husband is not, or could take basically what they had in excess and give it to the women who had need. And so it didn't always have to be money. It could be meals, could be lodging, could be clothing in Tabitha's example. So not only were believing men to provide for their extended household, but believing women were also to provide for their extending household. And so it's really important to realize in this discourse, Paul is charging the care of widows to the church. But here's where you don't mess it up. The true church is not the building. It's not even the governing elders and pastors. The true church is the people, all of them. And that's what the church means, the people of God. And the responsibility of true widows falls on the people of God. And it first starts with their children and their grandchildren. Second, by the men and their family. Thirdly, lastly, by the women in their family. And then lastly, it's the church that steps in with the excess that they have to help what's left. But here is the great thing of this whole thing. Most of this can already be taken care of by the church, by the people, before they become widows, by the proper following of biblical principles of husbands, wives, and families. And this is like a wound that is pouring out blood. And the first thing that you do is you put a tourniquet on that wound, and you stop the additional widows from being formed and the additional families from being broken apart. And that is how you start minimizing the numbers of those that you would have to care for. And then they become the minority and the exception to the rule, versus having your entire church have women that are desolate throughout. Amen.